yeah, what's your background? You have the speech, you have the book. How did you get to this point where you've been telling the story of Bitcoin so eloquently to where people resonate it?
Yeah, so I started my career in the traditional financial world. Started out in investment banking, worked in, and it was around the time of the Great Financial Crisis. So I was in New York doing M&A investment banking at Deutsche Bank from 2006 to 2009. I worked in the restructuring space after that. There was a lot of credit that needed to be restructured. And so did that as well as interim management at the same firm, kind of helping companies emerge out of bankruptcy or companies that were struggling and needed to be restructured. That serendipitously had me go over and work at a hedge fund for a long time. It was in Dallas, Texas, run by a guy named Kyle Bass, who had made his name shorting the mortgage crisis in 2007, 8, and 9. And it was really there when I kind of serendipitously went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. I was pursuing two paths of research while I was there. One was trying to understand what would happen when the Fed unwound post-financial crisis quantitative easing, the $3.6 trillion of emergency liquidity that they supplied to the U.S. financial system over the course of 2009 to 2014. At this time, in 2016 and 2017, the Fed had signaled that they were going to unwind the emergency measures that they had taken during the crisis. And so that was one track of research that had, at least at the time in my mind, nothing to do with Bitcoin. Of course, it ultimately turned out to have a lot to do with Bitcoin. But through that path of research, figured out why they had to put that money in, or why they thought they had to put that money in, and developed a view that they were never going to be able to unwind it, and they were always going to have to print more money, and that it was a function of the fact that the system was overly leveraged, and it was really only that way because of the existence of the Fed. So I first came to the conclusion that they were always going to have to print money. I realized that that was a problem, and then during the same time period, I was asked to go do diligence on a company in Canada. It happened to be a gold company. Serendipitously, though, that was how I got introduced to Safety and the Moose. And it was before he wrote the Bitcoin Standard, and he really helped me understand what makes money money, the history of money. And in and around that time, he had started to become interested in Bitcoin. My friend who had introduced me, Will Cole, to Safe was my Bitcoin guy, the person who was telling me about Bitcoin. And so first I had to understand what money was. Then I could start to relate it to Bitcoin and started to realize why Bitcoin had fundamental value, that it has a fixed supply that's credibly enforced. And it was really putting those two paths of research together. That first I had concluded that they were never going to be able to unwind post-financial crisis quantitative easing, and they were always going to have to print money, and I started to realize that Bitcoin was the solution to that. And when that started to click for me in 2017, and really when the picture started to come into focus, I decided that I wanted to, and that I thought my time would be better spent working on Bitcoin. And so stepped back from my role at the hedge fund that I was at in 2017 with a mind to work on Bitcoin, spent about the next year just going deeper down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, and ended up coming out the other side of that and joined Unchained and worked on Bitcoin custody for a long time. And then that's kind of, that's the path to Bitcoin.
And now, where are you? Or what
So
all are you
now
doing?
I worked at Unchained from 2018 to 2022, really helped bring the custody business of Unchained to market, the collaborative multi-sig. And while I was there, I started writing about Bitcoin. And really, it was intended originally to be a newsletter as a way to get exposure to what we were working on at Unchained. And really, through that process, it organically transitioned from a newsletter to something more fundamental, providing my view of Bitcoin, of how I would explain Bitcoin, and answering some of the hard to answer questions. And so through that period, working at Unchained, I developed a body of work writing about Bitcoin, and stepped back from Unchained at the end of 2022 to turn that writing into a book that turned into the book version of Gradually Then Suddenly. And then once I got the manuscript done for that and got more to the production phase of the book in terms of the design and the packaging, I started to think forward to what I would want to do next. And it was, these years kind of run together, but it was really just last year when there were a series of bank failures in the United States. And Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic, Signature, which had a little bit of a different story than those other two. And it started to elevate in my mind the urgency to work on Bitcoin payments as a rail. So now, in addition to being out there and marketing my book, Gradually Then Suddenly, I'm working on Bitcoin payments at Zapright, which is a company that's focused on enabling individuals and businesses accept Bitcoin as payment directly in exchange for goods and services. So I think, the first thing that people worry about when their bank fails is my money lost? How am I going to make payroll? But banks are also how you receive funds from your customers, receive sales, receive cash flows. And that I had known the fiat system was fragile, but those bank failures really kind of sharpened my pencil around the need to start working myself. People have all been working on Bitcoin payments for a while, but it sharpened the need in my mind for me to work on that as a next chapter in my life.
Very good. Yeah, I'm glad that you're working on that. We definitely need that in the space. If we could go back to the gold discussion. Why gold? You talked about you were doing the diligence on this gold mining company in Canada. Why did gold become monetized? Why did gold for thousands of years remain the dominant form of money? Platinum and other things are more finite than gold, and many of us Bitcoiners talk about the finiteness of Bitcoin. And so, is that an argument against Bitcoin? Help us understand, why did gold become the global store of value and not platinum or loop tokens or something else that is quote unquote more scarce than gold?
So on my journey, I was somebody who, up until that period of time, would have said gold was a barbaric relic, and if it's just a shiny rock, why would I ever need gold? If I'd rather have guns and cows than gold. And I realized that was it was certainly a naive understanding, but it was not informed by the history of what money was and how money emerged. And so when I started to have that unlock, and Safety was really formative for me in understanding, is first understanding the role of money. And then when you understand that it emerged organically as a good to intermediate a series of transactions or a series of exchanges, that the world didn't just suddenly magically adopt gold. They used different goods that preceded gold, and that gold was an evolution or an advancement in money. And the way that I would describe it is that oftentimes people either don't appreciate gold and they say it's just a shiny rock, or they're gold bugs. And that one way I think about it is that you have to start from the perspective that the world did converge on gold as money, and that gold wasn't always money, that actually happened, that the whole world aligned on one standard. The reason why I describe that, why that happened, and I talk about this in the book Rather Than Suddenly, is that something very fundamental happens with money, and it's that money converges to one, that economic systems converge on a single form of money, and that they do so based on necessity, because the problem that money solves is one of trade and exchange. I have to have the form of money that you're willing to accept, and then part of your acceptance of that money is based on what is the next person going to accept, and that it's actually an objective evaluation. We are both objectively evaluating different goods in the market to use as money to intermediate a series of transactions, and part of our objective evaluation is, consciously or subconsciously, a realization that it's an intersubjective problem. You and I have to trade and exchange, and that one of the places that I start is this recognition that, on the gold bug side, is that something about gold that made it money was that it was physical. And I think to the point that you bring up, like, why not platinum, why not silver? And silver was used as money, but gold won out. If you think about the fact that first, the world did converge on gold as money, and then second, that there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of goods in the world, well, why this one thing? So it's like, before even explaining the why, just accepting that it did happen, and that if you believe that humans are rational, which I believe, that they didn't converge on gold because it was a grand hallucination. So it was rational. And then the way I would explain the why is that scarcity is the foundation of money, and that gold is relatively scarce amongst all other physical things in the world. But it's like you said, it's not the most scarce. There are unique things that are singularly scarce, that are terrible forms of money. And so while scarcity is an important part of the equation, I think about it as the foundation of money, the foundation of a form of money's ability to store value, it's insufficient. It needs to be both scarce, a good to emerge as money needs to be scarce, but it must be able to be divided and aggregated into large and small units. That is important because the same good needs to be able to trade things of large and small value. And then a third thing, that good actually must need to be able to, if it's going to facilitate trade and exchange, it needs to be able to actually be transferred. And of all the goods in the world, gold emerged because it was relatively scarce. It was perfectly pure, so it could be divided and aggregated. And if you divided a gold bar into a tenth and 9/10, the tenth is actually a tenth, and the 9/10 is actually a tenth because it's pure and fungible, and you can actually transfer it. And so it's really the aggregation of, and there are other properties, but that's kind of how I distill it, is the scarcity, the ability to divide and aggregate, and the ability to transfer. And some other good might have been more scarce than gold, but it wasn't as it wasn't as malleable to be able to divide and aggregate it. And gold's also indestructible. You drop a bar of gold to the bottom of the ocean, find it in 1,000 years, it's going to be chemically the same. And so the durability was also important. And then, I started to understand that all of those properties also exist in Bitcoin, but it was that distillation of properties where I started to realize that if there were 1,000 goods in the world and the world converged on gold, and those other 1,000 things were all physical, gold had to emerge not because it was physical, but despite the fact that it was physical. And it was